Welcome to the Maritime Matters podcast. Did you know that 98% of Australia's trade passes through the maritime domain? 91% of its fuel is imported, and Australia's exclusive economic zone is larger than its mainland. It's easy to see that to Australia, maritime matters. Maritime Matters is the podcast where we break down what the week's events mean for Australia's maritime security and the wider Indo-Pacific.
Welcome to another episode of Maritime Matters. So we're recording this on Monday, the 29th of July. So if something super exciting happens in the next 12 hours and we don't talk about it, that's why. It takes us a long time to edit this as well. Hey, Richard, how you going?
I'm not too bad at all, surviving the Canberra cold. I understand you've managed to be jetting off and enjoying the hopefully rather warmer Western Australian weather.
It was warmer, although it was raining, which is a little depressing. So I was lucky enough to be at the Indian Ocean Defence Symposium last week, run by the WA government, Perth US Asia Centre and AMDA. And it was really pretty cool. So there was certainly a big focus on AUKUS, as you can imagine, a big focus on shipbuilding. The heads of Navy from Australia, the US, the UK, Japan, Singapore were present alongside other senior representatives. So it was a really good symposium to take part in. Of course, I was very excited to speak about all things AUKUS, shipbuilding, industry, Indo-Pacific. What have you been up to?
Oh, mainly, to be honest with you, trying to keep up with following what's been going on over there and feeling distinctly jealous that I'm stuck here and having to get on with the day job and not managing to get over there and do that side of things. So yeah, nothing very exciting. That and the continuing and ongoing AUKUS discussions that seem to never end at the moment. So. Yeah, I'm really interested to hear a little bit more as we unpick some of those things, and you can tell us all a little bit more about what was going on there. Anyway,
love to. I did try and get you some Ghost Shark socks, by the way, which were going around the trade floor, but alas, there were none left, so you don't have a pair of Ghost Shark socks. But maybe Andrew, if they're watching this, can send you a bit.
Devastated. It's like I got a squeezy submarine last time at Sea Power, and that's was great until some of my students, I think, nicked it. But that's what happens here at ADFA, you see. So you can't keep your squeezy submarines for long. Anyway, moving on. What's been happening in the region over the past week or so?
Right, so we said the same thing at the same time, which means I'm meant to answer. Great, well, lots of things happening. So I guess over the weekend we saw the Philippines conduct a resupply at Second Thomas Shoal. Now, this is the first resupply of Second Thomas Shoal that has occurred since the Philippines and China came to their agreement. Now, the nature of their agreement isn't clear. What was contained in it, not sure. They haven't released publicly, understandably. There was a little bit of contestation about 24 hours after the announcement of the agreement. There seemed to be some comments from a Chinese spokesperson saying that there wasn't such an agreement or they hadn't come to an agreement. But either way, there obviously is something in place because the resupply took place. Obviously there were Chinese vessels present, as they always are at Second Thomas Shoal, but they held off. There were certainly no issues in terms of use of water cannons or ramming, etc., etc. It went on without incident. It was a civilian vessel protected by or escorted by a Philippines Coast Guard vessel. So it does seem, at least for now, that there must be some degree of agreement in place and that things have calmed down, at least for the moment, around Second Thomas Shoal. What was your takeaway?
Yeah, well, I was quite interested in this because of precisely that immediate follow-up where there was a statement released by a Chinese official about the fact, something to do with the fact that the Philippines needed to kind of pre-register any resupply and have it supervised by the Chinese, and then there was a response from the Philippine side. So and some people were sort of suggesting this was the deal kind of breaking down already. So it's interesting to see this having taken place and seemingly having gone, certainly for the first time in quite some time, without incident. So it does suggest that actually there's perhaps a little bit more substance to the deal than some feared. And I think it just kind of chimes with what we were saying last week about this being hopefully a sort of a step back from the brink, as it were, a little bit, and hopefully also might, in time at least, allay some of your concerns about the Scarborough Shoal parallels here, or hopefully not parallels, as the case may be. But I think we'll have to kind of wait and see on that particular one.
Yeah, look, there have been many agreements over the years. I think if we see a reduction in the escalation that's occurred in the last 12 months, that's great, but I don't think we're anywhere near a resolution of this issue.
No, I don't think this one's going away anytime soon, but removing a little bit of the heat and tension sounds positive. Elsewhere, we saw a few bits and pieces of commentary around Chinese survey vessels operating in the Indian Ocean, and with some kind of breathless reporting about the likelihood of them snooping on Indian Navy exercises, which I think is I think it's interesting. I think it's particularly interesting, actually, in the light of our conversations last week about hydrographic survey, and the degree to which Australia is kind of getting out of this game and relying increasingly on commercial partners to do so. And this is in stark contrast to what is happening elsewhere. And this is by no means kind of the first or the only example of this. It's sometimes referred to as a spy ship. I think it's a survey ship. Is operating and has been operating for some time in the Indian Ocean, resupplying out of the Maldives. It was previously resupplying out of Sri Lanka, but there were some issues there, and the Indian government's been putting quite a lot of pressure on Indian Ocean nations not to help or support the Chinese doing this. But it plays into this notion of hydrographic survey being part of this kind of wider great power competition, particularly seemingly in the Indian Ocean, but I think it's also playing out elsewhere. And that again raises, I think, questions around whether or not this is something that we want to be completely outsourcing to commercial operations. Anyway, what were your views? Anything? Did you see this as a non-story, or anything particularly interesting out of this?
Look, it's not new. I think it is a research ship that has some capabilities beyond hydrography, and so there was some concern that India had put out a notice to mariners or something similar, saying they were going to do a firing, which was suspected to be a missile launch as part of its exercise, and this ship was hanging around. I mean, this is pretty standard. Countries do spy on each other's exercises, and China is pretty overt about it. You know, they say that China has been to RIMPAC in many years, but that's not true. China goes to RIMPAC every 2 years. They're just not invited. Same as Talisman Sabre. But I think it's important to keep highlighting. Marcus Schultz from ASPE had a great piece in The Strategist last week that I would recommend, talking about the Indian Ocean and the fact that we need to do more. I have a piece with USSC coming out in a month or so on this topic. And I think that when we talk about the dynamics in the Indo-Pacific region, what we're normally talking about is Southeast Asia, East Asia, and the Pacific. And I think that the competition that is playing out in the Indian Ocean is something that Australia should be significantly concerned about. And so I think, just highlighting that this has occurred. Again, this vessel has been operating there for a long time. It's created some geopolitical tensions between Sri Lanka, India, and the Maldives. But I think it's important to just continue to highlight that this stuff is happening, because we don't have a lot of presence in the Indian Ocean.
No, absolutely not. And the Indian Ocean is sort of long been this kind of backwater. And I think there's actually some really interesting parallels to the growth of Soviet naval and military presence in the Indian Ocean in the 1970s and 1980s, and the issues that caused for Australia. So it's certainly worth keeping an eye on. I think my kind of one slight pushback against some of these narratives is that Chinese military and naval presence in the Indian Ocean is still pretty small, and their sort of basing infrastructure is still relatively limited, and their resupply capability is something that I think I'm not an expert, super close PLAN watcher, but from those who are, I think there's been some surprise that there hasn't been greater pressure on sort of an expansion of that capability over the past few years. So we're still a long way from seeing a sort of continuous and very large PLAM presence in the Indian Ocean, but it's certainly expanding and something to be very much keeping an eye on.
So I agree, but one point in that, I think a lot of people look to the kind of Chinese approach beyond kind of the first island chain, and they say, well, they're not establishing bases or doing large deployments in the way that we would traditionally see global navies do. And, obviously I'm thinking of the US, but not just the US and that, the UK, etc. And that's true, right? And it is true, and it's an important point. But I do think that there is a lot of investment from China in a lot of the port infrastructure, specifically in the east coast of Africa and in the Western Indian Oceans. Now, these aren't traditional bases, but I don't think that is their strategy. They do allow access and they do allow sustainment. So whilst I agree with you that we haven't seen a significant large increase in PLAN operations since kind of the establishment of the base in Djibouti and the counter-piracy operations, I do think that there is certainly a strategy in terms of access and sustainment. Because there's not a lot of other reasons you'd be investing in some of this infrastructure, and whether that is port infrastructure in Tanzania or Mauritius or etc. So I think it is something to watch, but shouldn't be overstated.
Yep, I don't think we have any disagreement there, which is unfortunate. But we will have some disagreement where we're going next. So we're heading to the Red Sea.
Right.
Okay, so moving on and moving to the Red Sea, we were talking a little bit about the Red Sea last week, and you had a piece out in the AFR talking about whether or not Australia should be deploying something more significant to the Red Sea in support for the operations against the Houthis. But there is Australia has stepped up in at least one regard in the Red Sea. So what's been happening there?
Yeah, so I had a piece out in the AFR. I think we talked about it briefly on Monday. It's a consistent line that I've pushed since November last year in a number of pieces saying that we should talk about deploying a ship to the Red Sea and kind of highlighting the benefits to Australia, reminding Australia that you can't draw a bubble around Australia and say this is what we're going to defend, because when it comes to our national interest in our maritime trade, it'll invariably be outside of that bubble at times. The second point is that, we have some pretty great capabilities in our Royal Australian Navy, including things like the homegrown Seafire radar on the Anzac class ships. And it would be good to see how those capabilities and tactics and procedures perform in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden in that general area against some of the Houthi capabilities. So that was kind of my argument, fairly consistent argument. There has been reporting since from Andrew Green coming out suggesting that Australia is sending personnel to take command of the task force that is in charge of Operation Prosperity Guardian, which is the defensive operation protecting maritime trade under the Combined Maritime Forces. That article has come out. It's an interesting read. It hasn't been confirmed or denied by Defence at this stage. But Australia is a key part of the Combined Maritime Forces. I think I've spoken about it a fair bit. It's an area close to my heart and has been for a long time. So it probably wouldn't be a surprise if Australia was considering taking command of the task force. The Defence Minister did come out last week, though, and reiterate, as did the Chief of Navy at IODS, that Australia would not be sending a ship to the Red Sea, and it being a question of priorities. So it's good, I think, to see Australia talking about the fact that we understand that our dependency on maritime trade and the length of our sea lines of communication mean that we need to be thinking about these areas. So whether you agree, and I know you don't agree in sending a ship there, I think it's a healthy debate to be having. What's your take on the Red Sea?
You're preaching to the choir in terms of sea lanes of communication and the fact that we are reliant upon this global net of communications. It's the line I was pushing very strongly in the article I had out recently, trying to push back on some of the narratives around sort of the territorial defence of Australia and Hugh White's arguments, etc. So I'm entirely in agreement there. I do I must say, generally agree with the argument around priorities. Australia has always been reliant on these global sea lines of communication. We've never been able to defend everything everywhere. We have always been a partner in that, and we contribute in our way in our region and rely on others to do the heavy lifting elsewhere. That is not new. And my view at the moment is that there's enough going on in our region which we should be focused on, and we should be pushing hard to get particularly the European Union, I think more than anyone else, and European navies to step up in the Red Sea, which is much more of sort of the core area of their focus. It affects their trade rather more than it does ours. So that would be my take. I think whether or not we, Australia and RIN personnel, take command of the task force, I think that seems entirely sensible. I do think that in terms of priorities for a very limited fleet, and one of your regular narratives on here is about how the fleet is getting smaller. So I think in that regard, I do question whether or not this is an area of priority. And particularly my issue here is we send a ship once, one deployment. This issue is not going away. And I don't think anyone has come up that has presented to me a convincing argument as to why this would go away anytime soon, despite everything that the Americans and Brits have said that's going to happen. It's not. So do we get dragged into regular deployments to the Middle East? And you've only got to talk to people who were involved in the deployments throughout the sort of 1990s, 2000s, 2010s to talk about some of the implications that had on the Navy. So those are my kind of reservations and why, whilst I agree with your big picture, I don't necessarily agree with the line and the conclusion you reach.
No, fair enough, and I'm glad you don't, because it actually makes this more entertaining. A couple of points on that. Firstly, yeah, absolutely, we have all sorts of different priorities. This is, in fact, the only area where our maritime trade is being attacked. And yes, Europe is dependent on the Red Sea more than Australia, but Australia still has a significant amount of trade that goes through the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. Secondly, it also sends a message to other countries and other non-state actors who might want to interfere with trade where our resolve lies, right? So yes, in terms of there are other things happening, but this is the only area where ballistic missiles and cruise missiles, stand fast the Black Sea, are being lobbed into ships. So it's a different threshold. Second point, this whole commitment to, if we send a ship, then we're stuck there. The Australian commitment to the Middle East from a maritime sense was for a veritable degree of reasons. And it actually changed. And I think it is not quite correct to group in the deployments in the early 90s all through to the deployments in 2020 and say they were all for the same reason. They were for different reasons. And yes, Australia they were for different reasons. So Toowoomba deployed in 2020 to support the international maritime security construct because ships were being attacked. The ships went in the early 90s for a completely different reason. And the tasks evolved. So I don't think that sending a ship, we are committing to always sending a ship. But historically, we have had ships operate in the Red Sea because we do think it's important. And I don't buy the argument that we did it just to support the US whatsoever. I do buy that argument sometimes when you talk about land forces contribution, but not the maritime force contribution. Speaking of the Red Sea, though, we better move on. Good to see that we disagree. What else has been happening? There's also been happening in capability space.
So one of the things that I was quite interested in this week, we talk a lot about Navy, but this podcast is called Maritime Matters, so we have to talk about other people's boaty things. And there are some green boaty things happening, exciting developments. So as part of coming out of the DSR and the changes coming out of that, and the Army's real focus on littoral manoeuvre, one of the key capability acquisitions within that is landing craft. And Pat Conroy announced earlier this week that the construction of the two key landing craft programs, both the medium landing craft and the heavy landing craft, are being accelerated. So the 18 medium landing craft, these are around 500 tons. They're being designed by Burden and they're being built by Ostel at Henderson. The first is now set to be delivered in 2026, which is really not very far away in the context of this kind of thing. So that's being brought forward by 2 years. And then the heavy landing craft, and these are big things. They're sort of 3,000 to 5,000 tons. That's about, well, three and a bit thousand tons is the size of an Anzac. So they're large vessels. The first of these is being delivered now in 2028. Which is being brought forward apparently by 7 years. So really significant kind of step up in the pace of Army's acquisition of these craft, which is very much in line with the sort of the pressure to get the Army fit for littoral manoeuvre and to operate more effectively in the region to our north much more quickly. So I think that's good news story in that regard. I think it'll be interesting to see how this fits into wider pressures on Henderson and construction in the West. And it will also be very interesting to see whether or not Army is actually ready to crew any of these things in the time frame that they're going to get built. But that's a whole different kettle of fish. What was your views on this particular element? And I'm sure we're going to have some good inter-service rivalry going on here, right?
Look, I think that the transformation of Army into a more littoral-focused organisation is a good idea. I think it was a great thing coming out of the DSR. It should have happened a long time ago. It's good to see a follow-through with what was agreed as a recommendation of the DSR. Government agreed the acceleration of the littoral capabilities of Army, specifically their vessels. So I think that is positive. I do think that there is a lot of challenges with this. Everybody talks about AUKUS and everybody talks about the expansion of the surface combatant fleet, but I think front of mind needs to be the challenge that is transitioning Army into a service that actually operates more vessels than the RAN currently has surface combatants. So we're talking about 18 landing craft medium, 500 tons. So 500 tons is about the tonnage of an Armidale. So we're talking about operating 18 kind of equivalencies of different capabilities, but equivalencies of Armidales, which is more than the patrol boats operated by the Navy. It is about the equivalent of the Navy and ABF combined. And then 8 landing craft heavy and 5,000 tons, just to kind of picture that. So 5,000 tons is Tobruk. So 8 versions of HMAS Tobruk. So I think that this is going to be a real struggle, and the first one coming in 2028. And remember that in 2028, the Navy's surface combatant fleet, which will be tasked with protecting these littoral manoeuvre vessels, is actually still getting smaller. So we are currently at 10 major surface combatants for the RAN. So 3 Hobart-class destroyers and 7 Anzacs. Not sure how many are actually operational, but 10 on the books. By the time we get to 2028, HMAS Arunta will have decommissioned and there will be 9 surface combatants in the Royal Australian Navy. And that won't start to pick up until 2029 at the earliest. So I think there are a number of challenges. You mentioned the crewing. Obviously, there was some reporting early this year or late last year that Army was going to go through and send personnel onto the Warfare Officer course for Navy, teaching them how to drive ships, which is great. But the rest of the crewing, I think, is a conversation. And it's not clear the direction defence are going in. There has been a few things mentioned in terms of Army crewing themselves. Now, I can't remember the crew of HMAS Tobruk, but I want to say it was about 150. Not including a flight or a ship's Army detachment. I might be slightly wrong on that. But these are significant vessels with significant crewing. So I think there's some challenges in crewing. There's some challenges in also how they fit into the concept of operations and how they are protected. By and large, I think it's great to see them accelerated. But I do think there's a few things to come. And I'm not sure that people have really grappled with the size of the landing craft heavy, what that actually means. So 8 versions of Tobruk, which is actually larger than any amphibious capability we have operated I mean, probably since World War II. I'd have to check my history unless you know the details. And yes, a lot of people go back to World War II and say Army did operate a significant fleet of vessels. And, you touched on this a couple of episodes ago. That is true, but they haven't done so since. And in fact, the LCHs that used to be operated by Navy, I think they started decommissioning around 2005, 2006, something like that. Makes me sound really old. I never served on one. They had a crew of maybe 20. They were initially operated by Army, but they were handed to Navy when Army couldn't sustain the crews. So it's a good, positive story, but I think it's a watch this space. There are a lot of challenges with it that I think Defence are aware of, but they are going to be significant.
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting as to partly also why this is coming through. I've not seen any particular reporting on the motives for the acceleration, but I do think there's obviously something also going on here in terms of capacity at Henderson and more broadly in Western Australia in terms of submarine refits, in terms of when we're going to start seeing the GP frigates being built in the West, and all of that picture. So I think perhaps we're seeing playoffs here between when the Army's going to be ready to sort of actually operate these things and when they're likely to be able to be built. So it looks like a really kind of complicated picture in that regard, and it'll be interesting to see if we can get any more, if there anything more comes out about quite what's happening and why.
We are expecting a national shipbuilding plan this year, so that was a recommendation of the IAT that was accepted by government. So I think that we should get some clarification before the end of the year. But I get a sense that the aim in accelerating is actually to start ramping up WA as part of the continuous shipbuilding.
Yeah.
So part of it might be time frame about when they want Army to have these capabilities, but part of it also might be about ramping WA up to be in a position to start building the general purpose frigates from the early 30s
and filling the gap from the OPVs. So.
Right, and I mean, I'd have to check my facts on this, or I'm sure somebody will point it out, but the landing craft heavy is probably the biggest ship Austal has built in Australia. I'd have to check because they have built some ships in Australia for the US, the Marine Fast Cats and for industry. But it would be close, I would suspect, to being the biggest ship that they built in Australia. Obviously, they've built a lot of ships in the US. There's a lot of challenges to come. What else is happening from a capability standpoint?
So another bit thing that came out over the weekend was a new contract signed for the sustainment of Collins. Not a huge amount of detail, but it's a $2.2 billion sustainment contract. Obviously, this is a contract between the government and the government-owned shipbuilder ASC. So this is to provide the sustainment, and as far as I can tell, and you might be able to correct me here, but this is outside of the LOTE agreement from what I could read between the lines. So this is for sustainment of these submarines over the next 4 years outside of the LOTE agreement.
I was a bit confused on the reporting on that. I think the reporting says different things. So that was my initial read, and then I saw some reporting that this enables LOTE to take place. Either way, it's linked and it's part of that broader plan.
Yeah, it's about sustainment, and also there's quite a lot of focus on workforce development, which is going to be absolutely critical within this in terms of maintaining sort of continual maintenance, LOTE, and preparing for the sort of upskilling, etc., for SSN AUKUS, as well as any kind of maintenance requirements out at Surf West. So lots and lots of demands on workforce, and I think this is there's an important element of this is around that developing that workforce.
And I think also, the reporting, we've had this reporting a little bit through the year, but the reporting did seem to reaffirm the fact that 3 of the 6 Collins-class submarines are out of action. at least for the remainder of 2024. And I mean, that makes sense. When you have 3-to-1 ratio, right? You've got 6 submarines, and you can always expect 2 out of action. These submarines are older, and they're going through a major upgrade commencing from 2026. So that's not really a surprise, but it just kind of highlights the fact that when we say we're going to have 20 frigates and destroyers operating from whenever they finish building, I can't remember the figures. It's divide that by 3, then add a little fat, and that's how many you actually have.
Yep, absolutely. I was catching up on some of the varying AUKUS discussions and AUKUS debates over the weekend, and listening to Hugh White talking about whether or not we needed 40 conventional submarines in order to get enough on station at any one time. And I was thinking about you as some of this maths, but quite how we would ever manage to build and crew 40 submarines is entirely beyond me. But anyway.
And also, I'm writing about this today, so this is a key point, and also afford them. So when you look at the cost of the French submarine project, at its completion, the cost was $90 billion for acquisition, $145 billion for sustainment life of type, which it was saying potentially 50 years as opposed to the 30 years sustainment plan that's been put out for the AUKUS submarines. So you're already at $235 billion for the 12 Barracuda. Imagine 40 submarines. And this is the thing that drives me crazy when people talk about the cost of nuclear power submarines, which is expensive. Don't get me wrong, it is more expensive than conventional submarines. But when you actually compare the cost of the French submarine program to the nuclear powered optimal pathway, yes, it's more expensive, but not in the orders of magnitude that people seem to think when they throw around ideas of 40 conventional submarines.
Absolutely. And my one caveat with that, and I find it very frustrating, and the number of times you have people comparing apples with oranges in terms of cost is remarkable. But my one kind of pushback is the fact that defense does this all the time when it suits it. And you read some of the numbers, and they'll be, at one stage they're quoting intern figures and other outturn figures and all sorts of things like this in an effort to try and basically craft the right narrative. And then it complains when people don't really understand the figures. And to be frank, it's not really that surprising, because the number of different numbers that are hurled around at different stages for things makes it exceptionally difficult to follow, even where you go through kind of Senate estimates line by line.
I agree. Can I geek on for a minute? We're probably running out of time to talk about everything else. I know you want to talk about RIMPAC, SINKEX. You're very excited about it. I'm less excited about it, but yeah, it's great. But so yes, but so when Defence releases figures about projects, they are outturned. There was a mistake when the original figures were released for the French submarine program, the attack. Now, whether it was a mistake or not, who knows, right? There's different theories. That it was released in constant. So constant means the cost of the dollar as per day today. Outturned means the cost of the dollar in terms of today's expectations of inflation and foreign exchange impacts out to whenever you end the project, right? So there is a difference. And there was an ANAO audit review that said Defence Shore has released its costs in outturned. I think that when you look at comparing defence costs, you need to understand, is that purely an acquisition cost, i.e., a unit price? Was that an acquisition and supporting infrastructure costs? So your workforce, etc., etc., etc. So when people say, for example, you can get a B-21 for just under $1 billion, that's great, but you can't get any of the weapons, any of the infrastructure, any of the people, etc., etc. So I think that, and you need to ask the question, is this a life of type cost, which the ANAO has said Defence now needs to calculate. So that's not only acquisition, sustainment, but also disposal. So anyway, my point is, I know you're getting bored, so we'll move on. But I think there is a little bit to understand when we're talking about these costs. And yes, I'm sure Defence are creative sometimes, but I also think sometimes people who comment on these things just don't actually understand what they're talking about. Anyway, we'll move on.
I 100% agree, but I would challenge your notion that there was one mistake. I would have to go back and double check, but I'm pretty certain exactly the same thing happened when they announced the Hunter figures.
You're probably right.
Which went from 30 to 45 billion very quickly.
Now 65 or something like that. Yeah,
so
you're probably right.
Anyway, moving on. You wanted to talk briefly about USN VLS rearmament.
Yeah, right. So, look, this is something that's been tracking for a while. So, the Secretary of the Navy for the US came out in 2022, December 22, I think, and said that one of his key priorities was to develop the capability to rearm the vertical launch systems on US ships at sea. So, not only does the US not have this capability, Australia doesn't have this capability, UK doesn't have this capability, most navies don't have this capability. It was a capability that ships did have during the Cold War. Now, not a particularly reliable capability in terms of the sea states, etc., but there was a capability to rearm missiles at sea. As I said, I've heard various stories about how effective that actually was. But this is now a priority for the US Navy. So they did announce late last year or early this year that there would be an at-sea trial of this. In 2024. Yet to see that, but last week there was a land-based trial of the capabilities they would use for the at-sea trial. So I think the point is, has this really progressed? No, but it does remain a significant focus. And I think that they will crack it. And then hopefully, obviously, Australia will follow suit with integrating those capabilities into our replenishment capabilities, which is a whole other issue that we won't delve into here. Given the time, I know you're excited. Do you want to talk about the RIMPAC SINKEX?
No,
Somebody needs to send you to RIMPAC.
I think the only thing that I was interested in particular was the use of QuickSync, which is a relatively cheap munition being developed primarily by the US Air Force as a guided munition against ships, which is by order of magnitude cheaper than some of the missiles, things like the long-range anti-ship missile, etc. And I think this is something that's interesting. It's something that I've been kind of paying attention to for a little while. And I think you're also seeing interest now from the United States Navy in developing a much cheaper missile for much the same reason that we have very, very expensive, exquisite munitions, which are great. But if you want to sink anything other than a high-end adversary sort of as a target, you might want something that's a bit more affordable and you can have in sufficient mass to actually be able to deploy more widely. So I thought that was interesting. And then, of course, typical in the Air Force, they get a nice cheap munition and then drop it from a B-2 bomber, which is sort of in some ways defeats the point. But the idea was there anyway. And I'm going to stop talking about SINKEXs anymore because I'm going to get mocked otherwise.
No, not at all. Not at all. I'm just thinking of the night before when you're forming up the screen to get ready for the SINKEX and how painful that is. So that's what I think of when I think of a SINKEX or a RIMPAC FOTEX. But anyway, look, I think that's probably all we've got time for. Is there anything else you thought we should touch on? There's always lots happening in Maritime. Maritime does matters. And in fact, I do need to highlight, I think we got an unintended shout out last week at IODS. It was great to see in the Chief of Navy's IODS presentation that a key element of that presentation was a slide entitled Maritime Matters. So I am assuming he's a great fan of the podcast.
Absolutely. He must be a devoted listener.
I'm sure. Well, thanks, Richard. Great to chat.
Thanks, Jen. Chat next week.